Welcome back to Advancing with Watercolor. I'm Gary Tucker, and today I'm going to talk a bit about working on location in conditions or lighting conditions that aren't optimal. Sometimes we work out of doors and we have a very kind of gray day, uninteresting day, and such as today. We're down in Boston at the corner of Boylston Street and Berkley, and it's a beautiful church that we see in front of us. Interesting crosswalk, interesting public lighting, architecture is beautiful, but it's all rather flat. If you look at it, there's not a lot of beautiful color or even edges. Everything is kind of hard-edged. In these sorts of conditions, or on a day like today, a gray day, I like to imagine or evoke the feeling of a rainy day. And sometimes I even limit my palette to one color. I'll just use neutral tint. Today I'm using neutral tint, which is basically a black, except that it has no warmth or no coolness, so that it's a very simple color, but it has a huge range. You can go from very light to very dark, and that's why I like to use it, because I can really explore tonal values or lights and darks and observe how they affect the mood, observe how they create depth, observe how they create a feeling of atmosphere in the painting. And I'm using that approach to my subject today, which is looking down Berkley Street towards the distant church. And you notice that I'm starting very, very light, haven't done anything to the sky, trying to relate this wash to a very pale sky and see if we can make the painting work this way. So I want to evoke either a rainy day or a day that's very misty, a day that perhaps rain has just passed and we still see some wetness on the ground for reflections. And I'm employing a couple graded washes here. You notice that the wash starts very light at the top of the wash, the beginning of the wash, the top of the paper. As the wash comes down, while it's still wet, I'm adding a darker wash of color so that we get this transition. This transition, in terms of the visual language, creates a feeling of light bouncing off of the subject. So light is hitting the top, or light is not hitting the bottom, or light is bouncing back up into the building. This sort of graded wash is so useful for creating that sort of effect when you have a very bland day. If you can look at your subject and possibly determine there is a change from top to bottom in this shape, going from light to dark or dark to light, I would exploit that. I would exaggerate that for effect. That's what I've done here. And in this painting, I want to use this controlled tonal approach, going from light to dark, using graded washes, some cases using very soft edges as in the foreground, to create a feeling of a very atmospheric day. In other words, it's about to rain or has rained, and that is affecting the shapes. The humidity in the air is affecting the tonal values as well as the edges of my shapes. So in that first sequence, I established all the major shapes, from the background of the church to the foreground to the right-hand side of the brownstones that we see, and I created a sort of stage. And now on my stage, which is in the lower third of the painting, I'm starting to place the characters of my painting, the figures, and using smaller brush and now a darker version of that same color. And what do I hope to evoke here is several things. One is my main subject is a dark subject against a light background. So I've established the light background. I can now be very simple in my approach and paint my main subject with a dark application. And right now it looks completely disjointed. But as we move through the painting, we'll make connections. And I understand this, so I'm not worried at this point. I'm not, it's going according to my plan. I keep placing figures. These figures also give a feeling of scale to the scene. Makes that church look immense, huge, which it is. But if we painted the figures on a larger scale, it would be not nearly the same effect. Also with these figures, I'm staggering them. I'm putting my main figure, which is now in the crosswalk, along with a couple of dogs, with a little darker interpretation, bigger certainly, closer to us with a little more detail, also separated from the groupings. This is a psychological part of our recognition, which when we're scanning, scanning through a group or scanning through our field of vision, and we see groups of people, we kind of scan over those. It's the individuals that catch our attention, those that are separated from the group. I'm making use of this idea to highlight my main subject. In other words, the groups of people we see as a group and we move on. The individuals that are separated from the group, we tend to linger on those a little longer for whatever reason. I don't know. I'm sure it's something to do with our evolution, something to do with our ability to survive. In any case, as a painter, I'm making use of that. And you see this figure that's closer, darker, and separated from the main group grabs our attention. Now I placed a couple of interesting marks in the form of reflections. These reflections are doing what I mentioned earlier, tying together the main figures, the darker figures, with that light tone that's in the foreground, and sort of wed this to the bottom of the painting and make it more of a cohesive image rather than two separate parts. Adding some of the public lighting now, also with a dark application. All this is to push back against that church, make it recede as a very pale silhouette, which in turn is pushing back against the sky. This right-handed side is just a little bit closer. It's pushing back against all of that. I've put a figure very close to us, but it's so close to the edge and so close tonally to the part of the architecture that's above that we really don't notice it until, our eye stops. It's not an attention-getting shape, even though it's a figure that's closer and darker than the others, because it's so near the corner of the painting and because it's so close in tonality to the adjacent buildings, figures, foreground. We don't notice it. So this is a strategy for an artist who works with figures and scenes such as this. And using this very limited palette, one color, neutral tint, I think it becomes even more clear how the thought process shapes the painting. If you look back to the photo, you'll see that none of these figures were present in the photo. These are all figures out of my memory, out of my sort of mental library, putting them where I want, in the manner that I want, so that they communicate a feeling of movement, a feeling of busy location. The reflections help to communicate that feeling of a wet street. So all these things are combining to give us a sensation of a very humid day. Perhaps it's just rained. It's still busy. There's still a lot of activity, still a lot of energy on the street, a sense of the architecture, a sense of place. All these things are being expressed, even though we're just using one color, and in truth, we don't miss it. So as an exercise, as a way to liberate ourselves from this kind of preoccupation we have with color and matching color, I think it's a very healthy exercise to do this sort of painting once in a while. It's certainly more enjoyable less stressful, and we learn something in the process. The something that we learn, we can apply it to a color version. Because now we have a structure. We know how to go in terms of tonality with light colors in the back, stronger, richer colors in the foreground. Let's look at another version. I did several versions of the same scene, sometimes going into the sky and doing a bit of work, varying the colors. My characters are similar. Here I've eliminated the distant reflections, little different feel, but still kind of a wet day. And then I went even further. I wasn't satisfied. I wanted to do a scene that was more temperamental, more evocative, and I imagined that the storm was brewing or the storm was breaking, maybe a bit, could even be a moonlit night. I used some very rich darks. This is all neutral tint except for those marks of red that you see. And those, I agree, they're a bit cheesy, perhaps, a bit too far-fetched, but I feel they give the painting some interest, and I did it in the spur of the moment. I really, sometimes I don't consider, I paint more from an emotional point of view, and so I felt like doing it, and I did it. And I live with the result. If I'm not happy with it, I can do it again. I can do another painting, and that's the attitude that I take, because I don't want these things to go undiscovered. I don't want them to be just ideas in my mind and not reach the paper. So I'll do this sort of image several times, evoking several different ideas. And sometimes I arrive at a painting that was completely unmeditated and very fulfilling. So I recommend this sort of exercise for everybody, using tonal values to create your image, thinking about lights and darks and how to best bring out your main subject. In this case, my main subject is being defined by either a light passage against a dark or a dark passage against a light. You can see my materials, the materials that I use for almost all of my paintings, by going to the description and following the link that's in that description to my website, where you can download a PDF and see the materials that I use. Everything is described there. You can also find additional tutorials, additional reference material, different reviews of books and things like this. A lot of material around the subject of painting, and specifically watercolor, you can find on my website. So I recommend you read the description in all of these videos, and recommend that you follow some of the links to my website. Thank you.